Okay, welcome back, everyone. And it's good to see you all here. Thank you for joining us for learning again. So we are continuing with, continuing with Rabbi Levi Morrow's class, Fear of God at the Nexus of Divine and Human Kingship. And just a second. So I have invited you all to be panelists, and thank you for those of you who have accepted that invitation. And it's nice to see your faces. And that just means that once we pause for questions, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask. Okay. Sorry. And yes, if there are questions in between, pauses for questions, you can type them into the chat and we will get to those. So this week, we're going to be looking at fear of God as a force for radicality. So with that, I'll pass it over to Rabbi Morrow. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. This week, we're going to pick up roughly where we left off last week. There's no requirement that you had to have been here last week in order to understand this, today's class, but I want to quickly go over some of the main points we talked about. We talked about the idea of sort of recovering fear of God as something simpler along the lines of fear of punishment, believing that there are consequences to actions and acting in ways God wants or doesn't want, something like that, rather than loftier forms of reverence or anything along those lines. And we did that in terms of political thought, the idea of God as king of the Jewish people, or the king in the relationship between the Jewish people and God, and that covenant, and the way that it makes certain assumptions about human nature that might be reflected in the existence of a yearly process of asking forgiveness and receiving forgiveness. This week, I want to talk about the way, starting with sort of fear as the basis for creating a covenant, creating a society, allows you to then move past it. One, we're not going to go into like contemporary political significance of this idea, but it's always worth thinking about in terms of if fear is a political force, which politicians or parties or ideologies are pushing for fear as an end goal, or fear as something to help you move past fear. And that's really what we're trying to think about today. That fear as a political force can also be an opening onto freedom. And we're going to do that first and foremost through the thought of Benedict or Baruch Spinoza. We'll discuss that in a second, and then we'll move from there. And we mention one quick text from a French psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan, and then look at some Torah texts that reflect these in a number of ways. And if last week we sort of saw the two realms of political thinking and Judaism as sort of parallel, and we were able to borrow ideas from the first category to help explain the latter, we're going to do the same thing this week, but in doing so, we'll notice that those two aren't actually things you can keep separate. That in some ways, thinking about God and Judaism on the one hand, politics on the other, means thinking about the same thing throughout. So with that, I want to jump into the PowerPoint. There's going to be a bunch of slides here from Spinoza, but I think we'll be able to move through it without too much difficulty. All right, so I've entitled this year From Fear to Liberation. We're going to sort of think about, as I said, the concepts like fear and divine kingship and the way they interact, and as well as the way they enable us to think about the relationship between religion and society. So this is first going to be the texts from Spinoza and Lacan. Benedict Spinoza, born 1632 until 1677. Many Jews are familiar with Spinoza to some degree or another. He is known primarily for being one of the most famous and relatively late cases of a Jew being kicked out of the Jewish community entirely. He tends to be known by Jews, therefore, mostly for his theology, his ways he thought about God as opposed to his political thought. The two are, as I was just mentioning, not able to be kept apart. Spinoza's theology and his political thought are deeply wound together, but we're going to focus just on the political aspects of it tonight, and even that, not too much. But Spinoza was briefly a pantheist. He believed that God and nature are fundamentally the same thing. And there's some debate if that means elevating nature to the level of God or reducing God to the level of nature. But that's a separate topic. And that's what got him in trouble with the Jews. Other Jews, he was Jews, but other Jews said, you're just making the biggest idol ever. You've made nature into an idol. And he was eventually excommunicated from the community. And he was one of the few people to sort of leave the Jewish community in Europe at that point in time without then joining the Christian community. He remained a sort of excommunicated Jew without converting to anything else. We're going to be looking at a text called the Theological Political Tractate that he wrote, one of his earlier works, the Tractatus Politico Theologicus in Latin. And it's interesting for a variety of reasons. It is one of the first early texts to be doing sort of critical analysis of the Tanakh in ways that would later become associated with academic study of the Bible. But he also is reading it politically. So for him, the Torah is a political document as much as it is a religious one, if not more so. And it's about the laws for a good society. And people may already be hearing echoes of things we talked about last class. But he also, much like we discussed last class, frames it very much in terms of questions of human nature. And if last week we talked about human nature, that maybe some political thinkers and maybe the Torah assume that people aren't always going to live up to their own ideals and their own commitments, Spinoza is going to take that one step farther. So I'm going to jump now to the introduction to the the Theological Political Tractate. Oh, before that, yeah, Spinoza and the Radical Enlightenment. This is the cover from a video on YouTube from a website called Then and Now. Great short video introducing this sort of idea, but also a phenomenal dissertation written recently. It's worth thinking about the fact that Spinoza is one way of reading Spinoza, a lot of what we're going to talk about, as opposed to Hobbes, who we looked at last time, who talked about the need for some sort of very powerful leader, some sort of very powerful sovereign to deal with the fact of human frailty and the fact that people don't always live up to what they'd like to. So you actually need to sort of put fear into people. Spinoza, as we're going to see, is actually much more positive. He starts off with a negative view of human nature, but thinks that on some level, through the creation of a society on the basis of fear, to whatever degree, you can actually help people move past that. And so a lot of very interesting work has been done on Spinoza's political thought in recent years, highlighting exactly the way in which he maybe moves towards something like anarchism, but at the very least, and we'll see this explicitly tonight, is a supporter of democracy and thinks that democracy is something we can make happen. Right, so this is from the introduction to the Theological Political Tractate. Because if men were always able to regulate their affairs with sure judgment, or if fortune always smiled upon them, they would not get caught up in any superstition. Since people are often reduced to such desperate straits that they cannot arrive at any solid judgment, and as the good things of fortune for which they have a boundless desire are quite uncertain, they fluctuate wretchedly between hope and fear. And so that's the opening few lines of the preface to his Theological Political Tractate. He opens it up with the problem of people being unable to regulate their fortune, the things that happen to them, and therefore getting caught up in superstition. Right? He says that we are incapable of really understanding what everything's going to happen to us, and figuring out in advance what's going to happen to us, and then making outcomes we like happen, and therefore we get caught up in superstition. And this lays out for this problem of people being caught up in fear, right? They fluctuate wretchedly between hope and fear, being torn between, I think things are going to work out well, and I think things aren't going to work out well. I think things are going to go good for me. I think things are going to go badly. is for him the basis. That's the basic nature of human society. We talked about last week. Hobbes says the state of nature outside society is war of all against all, war of everyone against everyone. For Spinoza, it's fear. It's that you are fundamentally concerned with your own existence on like a basic level of existence, and also getting things you like or avoiding things you don't like. And we're just not as good at making that happen. And this is a little harder for us to imagine today because most of us live so deeply ingrained within society. There are so many layers between ourselves and like the natural order of events and being exposed to nature that it's hard to imagine the difficulties of getting through a day and not knowing where your food's going to come from, or and not knowing who you might stumble across in the streets and if they might be friendly to you or not, and all of the different things that are outside of our control because we live within a society that's managed to set things up in advance, so in such a deeply controlled way. And so part of what Spinoza wants to do, he himself lives in a world very different from the one we inhabit, but also one far removed from this state of nature. Is that in both cases, for himself and for us, we have to learn to try and think outside of our society. What would we like to live without society? And he says part of the fundamental aspect of that, what that would mean is that there be, fear. Fear is a fundamental state of human life. He says, we see at once that it is especially those who have a boundless desire for things that are uncertain, who are the most prone to superstition of every kind, and especially that all humans, when they find themselves in danger, are unable to support themselves, and they implore divine assistance with pleas and womanish tears. And sorry about that line. They swear that reason is blind and human wisdom fruitless, because it cannot show them a sure way of acquiring the empty things they want. Right? So he says that this is a problem that sort of just goes downhill. People who really want things they can't get, just want, feel like there's no possible way to get them. You can't improve your own situation in life. They fall into superstition. Right? He goes on to describe how this leads to false religion, he calls it. So part of what he's going to do in the book, and we're not going to have time to really explore this at length, is he wants to make room not just for creating a good society, but creating also good religion, right? That there should be room for religion that allows people to believe what they think is correct and encourages people to think clearly and critically about what they believe and arrive at true beliefs. And he thinks that in order to do that, much like creating a good society, you have to find some way of overcoming this fear. Now, on the other hand, they believe that delirious wanderings of the imagination, dreams, and all sorts of childish nonsense are divine replies. There's all these things that have no basis in reason they think are really from God. That God is adverse to the wise, and that rather than inscribe his laws in the mind, he writes them in the intestines of animals, and that fools, madmen, and birds reveal them by divine inspiration and impulse. It is dread that makes men so irrational. Right? So much like Hobbes, saying the basic problem of human existence is fear, but it's not, as with Hobbes, fear of other people. It's just that we are so incapable of understanding things that it's that we feel fear all the time. And so that basic point is going to be important both for him and for us, that there's a tension between understanding things and being afraid of them, right? That so you often hear like people are afraid of the unknown, that what makes something scary is really not knowing that it's dangerous. It's all the things you don't know about it. And that's very much true for Spinoza. So the question that society is a response to, and that is like good religion is a response to, is like, what, how do we deal with the things we don't know? How do we create a life capable of grappling with safely navigating the unknown and moving from a position of fear of the unknown, where we're just responding to things out of fear and not wisely or smartly, to making calculated decisions based on our values and based on shaping our life the way we'd like to lead it. Hence, fear is the root from which superstition is born, maintained, and nourished. People are swayed by credulity only so long as they are afraid that all the things they have ever worshipped under the influence of false religion are nothing but the fancies of a despondent and fearful minds. Right. So he wants us to be able to sort of move away from all of these fantasies and false religion. And you can hear in this not just the influence of someone deeply ingrained in sort of Tanakh and Tanakh's critique of idolatry, but also very specifically Rambam's interest in a life guided by wisdom and reason and philosophy, and that moves away from superstition and false religion. This book is deeply engaged with Rambam. But I want to quickly look at the way he used Spinoza, based on that model of human nature, depicts certain models of government and the way they function. Because it may indeed be, this is still in the introduction to the book, it may indeed be the highest secret of monarchical government, utterly essential to it, to keep men deceived and to disguise the fear that sways them with the specious name of religion, so they will fight for their servitude as if they were fighting for their own deliverance, and will not think it humiliating, but supremely glorious, to spill their blood and sacrifice their lives for the glorification of a single man. Right? So we discussed a little bit last time, the way Thomas Hobbes thinks the fear of the government replaces fear of everyone you ever meet. You go from being afraid of anyone who could come across you to being afraid of just the one ruler, and that actually can be good. But Spinoza is pointing out, it's very, very hard to tell the difference between what's a good person to be afraid of in terms of the government versus a bad person to be afraid of. And it doesn't actually solve any other problem. It solves the most immediate problem, but it fails to actually lead towards something we might call freedom. But in a free republic, on the other hand, nothing that can be devised or attempted will be less successful. Well, for it is completely contrary to the common liberty to shackle the free judgments of the individual with prejudices or constraints of any kind. Right? So if we want to have something that we call freedom, if we value that, he doesn't say you can't have the powerful threat of government. He's still going to say that might actually be the necessary basis for government. But you have to find a way to do that that enables you to move through fear towards something else, that allows you to make space for the free judgment of the individual without, the thing that enables people to make decisions based on their values. I conclude that everyone should be allowed the liberty of their own judgment and authority to interpret the fundamentals of faith according to their own minds, and that the piety or impiety of each person's faith should be judged by their works alone. In this way, everyone will be able to obey God in a spirit of sincerity and freedom, and only justice and charity will be esteemed by everyone. So this is the society he would like to create, a society that makes room for everyone to, judgment and authority to interpret fundamentals of faith according to their own minds, but also where everyone will be able to obey God in a spirit of sincerity and freedom, and only justice and charity will be esteemed by everyone. That by creating a society, the same way Thomas Hobbes said, and we're going to see this in a second inside Spinoza, through sort of the use of fear, you can actually do is not sort of save people from a lot of small fears through the introduction of one large fear, but people can come together to shape their lives based on reason. This is jumping into the middle of the book. He says, if we also reflect that without mutual help in the cultivation of reason, human beings necessarily live in great misery, we shall realize very clearly that it was necessary for people to combine together in order to live in security and prosperity. They should, however, have had no hope of achieving this had they concerned themselves only to the promptings of desire, for by the laws of appetite, everyone is drawn in different directions. Thus, they had to make a firm decision and reach agreement to decide everything but the sole dictate of reason. Right? So, as opposed to Hobbes, who imagined someone sort of coming from the outside and forcing everyone to agree to listen to them, or making someone who's sort of outside them their leader, Spinoza is concerned, how do we decide all together to run things according to reason? This principle should play the most important role in the formation of a state. It is far from being the case that everyone can easily be led by the sole guidance of reason, right? So in trying to create a society together, we have to allow for human nature and try and work with that. For everyone is guided by their own pleasure, and the mind is very often so preoccupied with greed, glory, jealousy, anger, etc., there is no room for reason. Accordingly, even if people promise and agree to keep faith by offering sure signs of sincerity, no one can be certain of another person's good faith unless something is added to the promise. The sovereign, this person is going to be added to the sovereign right over all men, belongs to him who has the sovereign power, wherewith he can compel men by force or restrain them by threats of the universally feared punishment of death. Right? So that's how we're going to create a society based on reason. And you can sort of feel the irony here of using fear to create a society based on reason. which we've already said before that, fear and understanding are sort of opposites for Spinoza and in the way we think of them today. But the point he's trying to get at is that fear can be a basis that enables you to make good decisions otherwise. That if we think fear is what keeps us from using our reason, then sort of much like Thomas Hobbes proposed, using fear to combat fear, Spinoza is saying the same thing. But whereas Hobbes said you could sort of leave it there, that fear, a greater fear can shut down a minor fear, and you live in that sort of greater fear. For Spinoza, this enables you to move past fear. Fear can shut down fear, and then you can make decisions based on principle, based on reason, based on how you think you should shape society and shape your lives. Right? So this leads him directly to a discussion of democracy. A body politic of this kind is called a democracy, which may be defined as a society which wields all its powers as a whole. The sovereign power is not restrained by any laws, but everyone is bound to obey it in all things. Such is the state of things implied when men either tacitly or expressly handed over to it all their power of self-defense, or in other words, all their right. Right. So you see here he's trying to think of this model of a sovereign, someone who's totally empowered over all of society, as something that the people create themselves, that we may voluntarily choose to give power to this head of society. Therefore, having acted as we've shown as reason and necessity demanded, they are obliged to fulfill the commands of the sovereign power. Right. So having acted in such a way as to create a society based on reason and necessity, they now have to obey the government, however absurd these commands may be. Else they will be public enemies and will act against reason, which urges the preservation of the state as a primary duty. For reason bids us to choose the least of two evils. Right. So you end up saying that we have this sort of baseline level of fear where you have to be made for your own sake, be loyal to society and not sort of undercut society. But though, like on top of that, you have the ability to make society has a purpose. Society is not just about physical constraints. It's also about creating this society where you can, to whatever degree, shape your life based on reason. In addition, there's this democratic state's foundation and purpose, which is precisely, as we have shown, to avoid the follies of appetite, and as much as possible to bring men within the limits of reason, so they may dwell in peace and harmony. Anyone who is guided by their own pleasure and cannot see or do what is good for them is him or herself very much a slave. Right. So for Spinoza, I think it's a very important point. We are all sort of born into, or on a natural sense, slaves to our appetites, he says, right? And to touch briefly on the theological elements of this, it's worth noting that Spinoza sort of famously does not believe in free will. At least not free will in the sense that we think of it, because he says that you're just moved by your appetites. You're sort of pushed and pulled by hope and fear, as we saw in the beginning of this. And so the question is, how do you move outside of those? How do you move into some other way of living that's not just based on the push and pull of hope and fear? And the answer is through reason, and in this case also through trying to use some sort of force that can restrain your hope and fear, restrain the follies of appetite. Right? This is the only way you can move from being a slave to your sort of natural impulses to being free, is to have something like religion or government to enable you to make decisions based on reason alone, or primarily based on reason. This is a point to note where I think Maxine put the source sheet in the chat. The sources have even more text from Spinoza than we've gone through. I'd love to thank you all for sticking with me so far on this count. I know it was a bunch, and I cut some out. So there's stuff anyone wants to see a little more in this respect, including an interesting taxonomy of, for Spinoza, differences between a slave, free person, and a subject and a child, if I'm recalling correctly, the way they make decisions. That's all in the source sheet that will be shared in the chat at some point. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly read this line from Jacques Lacan, because I think it's a good summary of who was a psychoanalyst in the 20th century, as you can see here. It's a good summary of some of what we talked about so far for our purposes. which is this famous fear of God completes the sleight of hand that transforms from 1 minute to the next all fears into perfect courage. There's a fear of God is a sort of paradoxical thing that is not fear, but is in fact courage. All fears, I have no other fear, are exchanged for what is called the fear of God, which, however constraining it may be, is the opposite of fear. So the same way that the fear of society, for fear of the government, for Spinoza, enables you to move beyond fear. Jacques Lacan is putting this here in terms of fear of God in a less political sense, but it obviously has very strong political ramifications. He's just not giving it the same sort of here's how we create a society model. He's talking about, and this is going to be helpful also for bridging back towards the discussion of religion we're going to do after this, that fear of God in a simple sense of, I am a religious person. I believe that God exists. I believe that things that happen in my life somehow reflect the divine will. I believe there may be consequences for my actions. That can be a fear that if I'm afraid of God, I don't then feel fear towards anything else. That the greatness of God and the God's sovereignty, as we talked about last week, can become a reason to feel less fear and less angst and anxiety about everything else. Right? The same way Spinoza wanted us to move away from being a slave to all our fears and anxieties. Lacan is saying, yeah, fear of God does that too. So that will lead us to the first of our two sections of Jewish sources that I'm excited to look at with you. But I want to quickly stop sharing my screen and ask if there's any questions before I move out of this lengthy political introduction. We have some hands up. Maxine, you want to feel unmute themselves?
I saw Benjamin first, so
go ahead. Just maybe a little bit of clarity. How does Spinoza feel that democracy will solve this problem of people being irrational? It seems like it would make more sense for it to be more elitist, because maybe you can have an elite that would be rational, and that would be less superstitious. So you have a clear process of that you skipped, maybe?
It's not going to be possible to work this out all the way, because on some level the problem of human fear sort of always is going to exist, and like people are always going to be some degree of rational, irrational. But democracy has as its goal raising everyone as much as possible out of the state of being driven based on fear to agreeing to come together to make decisions based on rationality and reason and what makes sense. And the contrast with the dictator model, a dictator could make a society based on laws for everyone, and in some sense that's what superstition does. As we talk a little bit in the introduction of the book, superstition moves people not based on just their own sort of appetites, whatever, but because it's in both cases it's still very much connected to fear and fails to sort of lead most of the people out of that basic state of fear. So democracy has as goal sort of the elevation of most of as many of the people as much as possible in a way that sort of more elitist model wouldn't.
Cool. Can I try repeating on my own words, see if I understood it properly?
Sure.
It's just that pretty much democracy has an interest of raising the level, because I have a shared interest, because the person next to me also feels more rational, will help the whole society. But a dictator doesn't have that interest. He would rather create a greater distance between his rationality and other people. That's the idea?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Yael?
I think there was something left out in this jump from fear to transforming our fear to a higher power. Because when we only translate ira as fear, we leave out the awe part and the ascribing our benevolent, our Hashem, with the benevolent benevolence of that ira part of the awe. So I think that we get away from fear necessarily when we're talking about a religious, not only in Judaism, but I would say also in the time that he's writing with Christianity and Islam, that our benevolent Hashem, the benevolent divine, is we have no need to fear anything, because the benevolent divine is watching out for us and will take care of us even through death.
I hear that. I think that the only thing I'll say that is I think benevolence assumes, or at least the benevolence you're describing, it seems to assume there might never be consequences that we would experience as negative, right? So you can imagine a benevolence that includes like bad things happening when people disobey, or whatever, to use sort of that model. Meaning, you said a couple of things. Yira, you're right. There are many other sort of loftier versions of yira. Yira can mean awe for sure. One of the things that I think is interesting is that, like, we started last week, we looked a little bit at the text of the Siddur for the Yom Norim for Yom Kippur Rosh Hashanah, and it uses yira, but also uses pachad and also ema, and these are all words that might have more concrete senses of fear involved, and those are all parts of the Jewish tradition as well. So I think I really don't want to deny the visions of other models of yira, but I think it's worth thinking through what yira in a more concrete sense might do and might mean. And I think that you like the infinitely benevolent God model does exist in Judaism, and I assume also in Christianity and Islam. I'm not, an expert in that. I don't want to make too robust statements about that, but I think also models that Judaism also has models that believe more in almost simplistic, I would say, like models of like calculus of consequence and reward and punishment and action and things. And I think often in the 21st century, we're very quick to dismiss those, that they seem strange to us. And I think there's actually a lot of wisdom there in some ways. All right. If there's no one else, then we'll hop back and look into the PowerPoint and actually look at some Jewish texts now that you have. Thank you all for sitting with me through the political philosophy stuff. Now we'll get to what we're here for. Okay, so there are going to be two sections now. One I've called Yirat Shamayim as counterculture. The other one will deal more explicitly with politics, but both of them have to do with the way that if we take Yira as, a way of thinking about fear as helping us move past fear and move towards other forms of decision-making, then part of the question comes, how does that relate to other forms of society and other forms of fear? If just to go back to the simplistic sort of dictator model from Hobbes we mentioned last time, the big fear as opposed to the little fears that Hobbes said, you're afraid of government and therefore you don't have to be afraid of other people. If you say that the source of consequences, let's say that you're afraid of is, or you're concerned with is God, then you're no longer concerned with consequences that would come from other places, right? And so how does that put you into relationship with society? And we're going to look at two different texts about Yira and sort of the mitzvot, and in terms of society and culture, when doing mitzvot in a different society and culture. And then we'll look at a few texts going back to all the way to Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Shemot, about the way that might work, not just in terms of society, but also in terms of concrete political structures. So this is from Rabbeinu Bacha Ibn Pakuda, who's the author of the Chovot Levavot. The duties of the heart is how it's typically translated. It has some Arabic name I can never remember. He wrote it in Judeo-Arabic. He died in the year 1050 or so. I hope I'm getting that quite right. Details like that aren't quite my specialty, but it's a wonderful book. It is a combined sort of philosophical and pietistic work on thinking about God and human life in relationship to God. Its sort of twin goals are to move towards understanding a perfect, understanding the perfect unity of God in a philosophical sense, and then attaining a perfect unity of your own heart directed in service of God. So in the 10th gate of the book, the 10th section, he has a discussion of Yira that's pertinent to our discussion. He says, the second type of fear is awe inspired by his glory. And I should say, as I mentioned, he wrote his book in Judeo-Arabic. I, alas, do not read Arabic. And the translations into English of his work from Arabic into English are actually kind of hard to come by. There's a couple out there, but this is the text I took from Safaria, which is a translation that was done for free, made available for free. It's just a mitzvah that was done by the rabbi who translated it. His name I can't remember, but it is translated from the Hebrew, so that's worth noting. One of the interesting things that also happens is that, so I have here the text in the second paragraph, one of the pious would tell over. The pious is a phrase in Rabbeinu Bachya that could mean a pious Jew, but could also mean a pious Muslim, that he was deeply engaged with Sufi Islam of his time. There's a interesting story that about the it's called a it's a different time, but is he a lot of Sufi stories make it into texts like text from Chassidut, from the Baal Shem Tov and his students, by way of Rabbeinu Bachya. So he finds interesting connections that happen that way. But okay, second type of fear is awe inspired by his glory, exaltedness, and almighty power. This awe never parts from a man all the days of his life. It is the highest of the levels of the God-fearing. It is the introductory path to pure love. Whoever reaches this level of fear of God will not be frightened by anything nor fear anything besides the Creator. In the sense of, if you're truly focused on sort of God in terms of fear, then you won't fear anything else. One of the pious would tell over on a God-fearing man which he found sleeping in the wilderness. He asked the man, "Are you not afraid of lions, that you sleep in a place like this?" And the man answered, "I would be ashamed before God if he saw me afraid of other than him." Right? If God saw that I was afraid of something other than God, then I would feel shame about that. He doesn't really flesh out why that is. My simple assumption, it is sort of like we've been thinking about here, the question of, what are you really concerned about in terms of consequences, and where do you think that consequences come from? In the source sheet, there's a text from Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, a Kabbalist from Tzfat, in his book Tomer Devorah. I left it out of the PowerPoint because we're not going to have time to go over it, but there he makes a similar argument, much more explicitly, in terms of God being the source of lions and the one in charge and things like that. If you just take the consequences that happen to you as being ultimately traceable to God anyways, then there's no reason to be afraid of them. But Rabbeinu Bachya puts it in a more explicitly social context in the next two paragraphs. He says, "Another sign is that in fulfilling God's will, it is equal in his eyes, if people praise him or scorn him. When, to please the Creator, he bids them on doing good or refraining from evil." Right? He says that you no longer care what other people think. There's the sort of fundamental disconnect that begins when you say that what really matters is what God thinks about certain actions, right? That then it doesn't actually matter whether people praise him or scorn. If you feel praise or scorn. Another sign, he says, that he's willing to give up his life, body, money, and children to do the will of the Creator. As written, for your sake, we are slain all the day long. Alecha haragnu kol hayom. I don't want to get bogged down in the details of that, but so you can hear, echoes of Shema, that the sense of willingness to sacrifice everything, because what sort of matters is not society. It's not how are people going to respond to me, until the degree of, like, if people are trying to hurt you, you still wouldn't care about it, right? The ultimate sort of, if society's ability, government's ability to punish, enforce laws to the point of capital punishment was something that we spoke about last week a little bit, as a foundational aspect of society, then he's here saying, actually, fear of God should enable you to challenge that on some level. Fear of God should make you want to keep the mitzvot, even to the point where you can disregard that aspect of government. That God, in some sense, fear of God sort of disconnects you from the basic fear of government. And the last text for this section I want to talk about is from the Shulchan Aruch, from the very, very beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law, which it has on many, or almost all of its paragraphs. It has a commentary from Rabbi Moshe Isserles. The Ramah lived in Warsaw in Poland in I wanted to say 17th century, but I could be wrong on that. whatever. Yeah, so this is his first comment he makes on what's become known as the Book of Jewish Law, sort of a basic introduction to keeping halacha. He says, I have said to the Lord before me constantly, Shaviti Hashem lenegdi tamid. This is a major principle in the Torah among the virtues of the righteous who walk before God. For a person's way of sitting, his movements, and his dealings while he is alone in his house are not like his way of sitting, his movements, and his dealings when he is before a great king, nor his speech and free expression as much as he wants when he is with his household members and his relatives, like his speech when in a royal audience. Right? So the first thing he says is that consciousness of God, and this is the Rabbeinu Bachya mentioned this briefly, and we looked at this briefly in the Rambam Mor Nevuchim last week, and it's on the source sheet from last week. If anyone wants to go look at that, the Rabbi Moshe Ishalish actually cites the Mor Nevuchim in the piece I left out of this. Is that what it means first and foremost to have fear of God is to have this sort of constant awe of God. Right? It's at all times you feel as if you're in the presence of God, the same way you might say you're sort of in government when you're worried about like conscious of the law. That's something that applies at all times. But then the Ramah, towards the end of his comment, and I had mentioned again, it was a very long comment, so I left some of it out of the source sheet, but it is all on the I left some of it out of the PowerPoint. It's all on the source sheet. I think I put the Hebrew on the source sheet as well. He concludes, and all the more so when one takes to heart that the great King, the Holy One, blessed be He, whose glory fills the earth, is standing over him and watching his actions. He immediately acquires fear and submission and dread to God. May he be blessed. Is ashamed before him constantly. There's the citation of the Mor Nevuchim. And one should not be ashamed because of people who mock him in his service of God, and should also go modestly. Right? So the Shulchan Aruch, or the Ramah, has a sense that when you're sort of beginning the discussion of keeping halacha, when you're about to set out a whole multi-volume work of like what are the laws I think a Jew should live by, an important part of that is saying you're going to live in and around people who think you're acting ridiculously, right? Has a little bit less of the drama of the Rabbeinu Bachya saying, you should be willing to sacrifice your life for this. Ramah's not saying that. He's not saying you shouldn't, but he's talking about mockery, not about murder, right? And in some sense, it's much more relatable. Is that there's many parts of Judaism that make perfect sense to everyone around us, and there's many parts of Judaism that seem very strange. We have the holiday of Sukkot coming up, when many Jews will be walking around daily holding various plants in their hands, and it's one of those things that if met someone from had never heard of Jews before, it'd be very hard to explain. Laws around charity and visiting the sick, that's easy. That everyone gets that. That makes sense. Explain the plants, a little harder. And I was saying that having a basic sense of yira, of pachad, of fear of God, disconnects you from that concern for what other people think about you, what other people might be saying about you, and instead focuses you on your relationship with God and putting your actions specifically in context of God and enabling you to perform that with it, not saying like people won't be mocking you, but enabling you to do what you think you need to do to make choices based on what you think are the sort of basic principles that should be guiding your life, in this case, based on God, rather than based on fear of mockery. Okay, I want to stop the share again. I see there's some things in the chat. We'll talk about that. Maybe also questions from Facebook. Let's see what's happening in the chat. Yes, Janice, these are just comments about things that look strange. Yes, okay. But does anyone have any questions for the final section? Okay, I'm glad to hear I've made myself entirely clear, hopefully. I'm going to share my screen. Yes.
This is just speculation, but this Ramah, I guess, is commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, which says that like you should rise every day like a lion. I don't know. I'm just there's like a kind of interesting little tie in there, probably just coincidence, but Yeah.
Well, there's a question of how much you want to make of the details of it. Both of them clearly feel a need to begin their text on the halacha, on the law, with some form of inspirational passage, depicting yourself as resistant to mockery versus depicting yourself as a lion. It's very different, and you could flesh those out in different ways.
No, I was thinking about the Chovos Halevavos, like how that has, it's the person sleeping outside.
Oh, right, the lion.
Aren't you afraid of the lions?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about it. I don't know enough about the Chovot Levavot became a very important book relatively quickly. So it would surprise me if the Shulchan Aruch wasn't aware of it, but I don't know enough to know how influential it might have been. Okay. Now we'll look at some less medieval and more biblical texts for this last section. The first thing I wanted to note is from the Jews' own, instruction to create some sort of political structure. This is from the first chapter of Devarim, which rehearses the discussion of creation of judges from Shemot Perek Yudchet, the 18th chapter of Exodus of Shemot, when Moshe is told to appoint judges and given various qualities for them. And here in Devarim, in this sort of rehearsal, or Moshe repeating that story, he adds a line about how the relationship between judgment and God and other people. So the Hebrew here, I'm just going to read through the English. Moshe is speaking. So I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, and chiefs of 10s, and officials for your tribes. I charged your magistrates at that time as follows: hear out your fellow men and decide justly between any man and a fellow Israelite or a stranger. You shall not be partial in judgment. Hear out and low and high alike. Fear no man, for judgment is God's. And in matters too difficult for you, you shall bring to me. I will hear it, as I instructed you at that time, but the various things that you should do, right? So there's a highlighted line. Lo takiru panim b'mishpat, kakaton, gadol, tishma'un, lo taguru mipnei ish, ki hamishpat lelohim. Do not fear any person, for the judgment belongs to God's. And here he's not, to be fair, talking about yira of God, not talking about fearing God, but it's a clear sense of the tension between fear of other people and focusing on what God wants. Some question of principle that would be helped by the various contexts of fear of God. And notably, we looked last week at the mitzvot from the Torah to fear God, both of which appear in Sefer Devarim. So Devarim, since begins with this discussion of creating a law where the law is aligned with God, and it's aware that you might need to not be afraid of other people for that to happen, and then goes on to talk about fear of God, and other, later on in the book, in the 17th chapter of Devarim, talks about creating the political system. But I just want to start with that. I think it lays out that relationship very clearly. I now want to look quickly at two stories from Bereshit and Shemot, respectively, that highlight in the process of the narrative this problem, or the way, this idea that maybe fear of God would cause you or necessarily put you in tension with the human leader, with the human king. In the 20th chapter, Sefer Bereshit, is the second time Abraham's wife Sarah is kidnapped, and he has to sort of deal with that. Without going into every aspect of this story, I'll focus on one element. Is an Avimelech kidnaps Sarah, and eventually God appears to Avimelech in a dream and says, "Why'd you do that?" And Avimelech returns her and then confronts Abraham, and that's sort of where we're going to jump in a little bit here. So early next morning, Avimelech called his servants and told them all what had happened, and the men were greatly frightened. And so, just to realize I didn't spell it out well enough, Abraham told Avimelech and his countrymen that Sarah was not in fact his wife, that she was his sister, and seemingly based on that, they kidnapped Sarah. And yeah, so that's what they're coming back to having discovered the truth. They're challenging Abraham, why did you do that? So, what have you done to us? What's wrong that I have done? What wrong have I done that you should bring so great a guilt upon me in my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done, right? So you shouldn't have lied to me. What then, Avimelech said to Abraham, was your purpose in doing this? Here's the important line for our purposes. I thought, said Abraham, surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Right. So Abraham, he goes on to justify more the why he's describing his wife as a sister. But for our purposes, the reason he felt the need to lie is because there was no fear of God and how they would kill him because of his wife. And on some level, fear of God here is just in place of killing. It doesn't have to do with the fact that the king is the one here who was making a demand. The king is the one who demanded to take Abraham's wife. The fear of God doesn't have to be mentioned with the king, but I think the next story will make clear that it was. For now, to say it's very clear, fear of God is on the side of ethics, right? The fear of God, without fear of God, people will kill someone who will make decisions based on their baser appetites. Potentially based on fear of the king, that, like you say, the king wants, Abraham's wife, so we're going to kill him and give the king his wife. But certainly, at the very least, without fear of God, Abraham thinks you can't ask people you can't expect people to do the right thing. People will kill me without fear of God. But I want to propose, and again, we'll see this even more clearly in the next story, that the Abraham is concerned no one's going to say no to the king. The king is going to express a desire for my wife, and they're going to kill me because the king said so. And it's the king, no one's going to stand up to the king in a place where there is no fear of God. And part of the reason I'm inclined to read that reading is because of the next story, which is a very famous story. And honestly, this is the first, thinking in terms of fear of God as a political force, is the first time I sort of feel like this part of the story makes sense on a basic linguistic level. And this is the story of the midwives in the first chapter of Shemot, the first chapter of the book of Exodus, where Pharaoh has, told the midwives to kill all the Hebrew boys that are born, all the boys who are born to the Ivrim in Israel, should, kill all of them. And then the midwives don't. They choose not to. And the king of Egypt confronts them. And he says, again, just reading the English, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. They give him the command. If it is a girl, let her live. Right. So this is before he confronts them. The midwives, fearing God, did not do what the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. Right. And the midwives feared God, so they did not do what the king of Egypt said to them. Right. And it's very clear that fear of God doesn't mean something sort of simple ethical behavior, which is how it's sort of often read based on like the last chapter we just looked at. Like, no, their fear is toward God. They're concerned with what God thinks about their actions, and that could be in a somewhat sort of loftier sense, but it could also be the very simple fact of like they think God will punish them if they do the right thing, or they do the wrong thing, and God will reward them if they do the right thing. And the next few verses depict how they actually, did what they thought God wanted, and that God did reward them. But it is, choosing to make a decision to act based on fear of God rather than based on fear of the king, that leads them to do the right thing. That leads them to set off the story of redemption that is the rest of the book of Exodus. It leads them towards, the whole story we've spoken about earlier in this class and in last class about creating a society of, based on God and the Jewish people and things like that. Like, it all starts here with their fear of God pushing them away from fearing Paro, and their fear of God pushing them away from killing children. So what this all sort of says to me to sum this up, is that the question of, how do we make decisions and what do we think about consequences are very critical, not just for the sort of specific concrete things we do, but also broader questions of like, what are we oriented towards, and what consequences themselves are we concerned about, right? So to refer back to the mockery mentioned in the Ramah, or the like actual risk to life and property and family mentioned in Rabbeinu Bachya, like whose consequences are ones that we use to shape our actions and which are not. right? And so this can have all kinds of consequences in terms of our relationship with society around us. If we are willing to do things that make us look strange because we think they're right, but can also, in the context of, say, Shemot in the story, look like something like conscientious objection or civil disobedience, things like that. It can also, just in terms of the political level of moving beyond fear, it can mean voting based on principle rather than voting based on fear, and choosing what you think is right rather than choosing what you think is safe, and things like that. Like this pushes you in all kinds of directions. Think about the relationship between yourself, God, society, and politics, in terms of these are all overlapping realms, right? God and politics are not separate, because they're both ask questions of what are the consequences in our life that really matter, which one correspond to sort of who we are on the most fundamental level, and which ones do we want to let shape us, right? Do we want sort of consequences of what we think God wants to shape us? We want that to be the primary basis in which we make decisions, or are we more immediately concerned with our, like, getting food on the table, or our personal safety? And what degree does living in society or living in, with the sense of what God wants from us, regardless of society, enable us to move past voting or acting based on sort of what our own personal interests, and move instead towards thinking about issues of principle? Yeah. Any thoughts, questions? I would love to hear what anyone is thinking, wants to say, something like that.
Okay, I guess I'll read what Noah said for the recording. So this all reminds me of Tishrei, especially when the layout is how it was last year. Felt like there was only one workday in the month. It was the first time I had no sense of guilt about taking off for every sabbatical day. It wasn't something I was going to compromise on, so the shock, disgust, negativity from other folks just didn't matter to me.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think I have a slightly different situation. I live in Israel, so a lot of the holidays end up being national holidays. But then you do find other days, like Purim is not a national holiday, or even like Erev Chag is not usually a national holiday. And things like we decide, like, okay, so I'm going to use that for taking a vacation day, and I have to decide that it's okay that, like, I'm going to be out of sorts with society on those days, and there's a whole other sheer that what it means to have, like, a different calendar than the society you live in, and the way that fundamentally puts you out of joint with them. But I think it's a very good example of when you have to make this sort of decision. Yeah, Benjamin.
Yeah, I kind of have a comment, I think, more, which is something that I realized is that because of the ambiguousness of God's commandments in many contexts, there's kind of like this danger also where the feeling that God has your back, where you get the fear of God as a motivation, can also cause people to actually just amplify their own interpretations of whatever it is that God commands. And so there's kind of this double-edged sword where when you are right and you are on track with God, you have this really strong power, but it doesn't work in a very clear way.
That's definitely true. And I think in some sense, it's the problem with principle, or as I called it in the title of this year, radicality. The question of willingness to disconnect from normal frameworks and not worry about what society will say, is that it can be dangerous for that reason. It's hard to give a like catch-all answer to that problem, because on some level that's the basic problem of willingness to say that, like, the status quo is not necessarily optimal. Is that can be, you can say that in good ways or in bad ways, and there's no way to from the get-go rule out the bad ways. You have to just keep ethics in mind as a fundamental principle. The one thing I'll just share that in terms of that is a vort from Rosh Shiva that I always liked about. He says the Mishnah says a machloket shem shemayim, a debate for the sake of heaven, will exist forever. And the sense from the Mishnah is that is because, like, there's something valuable in both sides if both sides are dedicated to the name of heaven. But Rosh Shiva say, yeah, because people think that they're fighting for God, then they're never going to give it up, even when they should. So on some level that cuts against a lot of what I've been saying tonight, but the basic point I think is still a valid one, of the importance of making decisions based on principle and the way fear of God helps us do that. But you're right, you have to also keep in mind the limits of that and the ways in which that could potentially be dangerous, and that should keep you sensitive and clear-eyed to maybe be self-critical enough to also be careful about that.
It feels like that, like,
Do we know if Marx was familiar with Spinoza? And would you say that Marx's attitude toward religion was the same as Spinoza or the opposite?
It's a good question. A little beyond both the context of this year and my expertise. I'll say quickly that both of them were very concerned about like lower forms of religion and what that could do to people. Both of them also saw the potential value in it. Marx is famously quoted often about saying religion is the opium of the masses, but opium was also like a painkiller and a medicine in his day. Like, it's not as unambiguously negative a statement, but more than that I wouldn't want to get into. So he probably knew Spinoza on some degree. Spinoza became very important after in his own lifetime and immediately there afterwards, but I don't know the details beyond that. Any more comments? Anything from Facebook, or we are good to sign up for the holiday season?
Hi, I think that's it for this afternoon. Almost.
Thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you, Darisha, for giving me the opportunity to teach. Thank you all for exploring with me. It's a bit of an experimental set of classes, and also just the rest of your schedule, Darisha, looks incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined us and is part of our learning community at 4 p.m. today. Just half an hour. The next season of the Music and Liturgy project will debut on Facebook and YouTube. Soon after that, it'll be available on other platforms. And in this last week before Rosh Hashanah, we still have another 7 classes. So you can learn more and register for those classes at ll.drisha.org.